Hello, geographers. We're going to talk about development today. And I also have on Canvas that link to the movie Poverty Incorporated. It's a documentary specifically looking at development. And I talked about this in one of the other little videos I put together for you guys about watching that and, critically watching it. So, questioning what are the filmmakers trying to do? What are they saying? What's their big argument? Um, and what do you think about that stuff, right? So, you need to watch that. You also need to listen to this stuff, where I'll get into some more detail on some things and get into stuff I don't get into. Doesn't really matter which order you watch these in, so don't worry about it. Like if you haven't watched the Poverty Incorporated one, don't worry about it. You can watch it after, or if you want something that might be more entertaining to watch, first go ahead and watch that professionally done film, and then listen to me talking into a computer after that. Doesn't matter. Just, however you do it, watch both of those things. Now, with development, this term, it's a broad term. It can mean a handful of things. In this specific context, though, what we're really talking about is increasing the standard of living within a country. Okay, so, we all know about wealthy countries, poor countries, whether you've seen commercials where, charities are trying to get you to send money to help, poor children in some, whatever country and whatever continent, or we learn about stuff in high school, social studies classes, whatever they call it in high school now. So yeah, that's the idea. We have these impoverished countries around the world, and we want to increase the standard of living. We want to try to get these other countries up to that same standard of living that we have here in the United States. And you could say, we have poverty here in this country. We'll talk about that in more depth a little later on today, and we'll cover that throughout the rest of the semester. But for the most part, the standard of living here is a lot better than in other countries. And we'll get into what that actually breaks down into, what criteria we use to really measure that stuff. But the general idea is, let's make other countries pretty close, at least, to this country, or Western Europe, or Japan, or South Korea. Take your pick of the wealthy countries that exist. Let's try to bring all these other countries up to that same level, and we do so through growing the economy. Okay? So this continues our discussion of economics and geography and how all of that is linked. So it's not, the only way to fix these poor countries is to fix their economies. When they have more money coming in and a more stable economy, the country can spend their money, their profits, whatever, on important stuff, right? Whether it's the country itself or the people themselves or whatever. So that's the general idea with development in this context. Now, we of course, because this has been in every other lecture that I give to you guys, we have to talk about uneven development, or the core periphery model. And it goes back to this idea that we have some kind of core where power or wealth or whatever metric we're studying, all of this is concentrated in the core. And then as you move further away toward the periphery, meaning on the outside, you have less power, less wealth, less whatever value it is we're measuring here. And this is quite often used for this concept of development and just looking at countries and economics and wealth in general. We tend to see what we'd call uneven development, in that there's this small, tiny core of wealthy countries who are holding on to that wealth, and then a much larger group of poor countries on the periphery who almost have access, maybe can almost take part in a real globalized economy, can almost get that wealth, but they're never quite there. So as we're studying development, whether And you'll see in here, I'm a big critic of how development is handled, and that'll come through. It's not to say that I don't think we need to help other countries get out of poverty. I just think the way in which we do it is quite ineffectual. It's also what you'll see when you watch that Poverty Incorporated documentary. Although, and at a later point, I'll give a little talk about that film and my own interpretations of it. Things that I would normally do in a classroom setting. If we were just sitting around talking after we watch the movie, but I can't. So I'll get specifically into what I like about that movie I'm having you watch, and then maybe more importantly, what I dislike about it and some of the traps I think it falls into. So the point is, I'm all for development in the sense of helping out these other countries, but critical of what we've done. And one way to look at it, when people bring up uneven development and their solutions to it, it tends to miss the mark. And maybe even we shouldn't be thinking about things in a simple case of wealthy, poor, middle ground. This idea of having poor countries have to follow these steps to get up to be considered to be developed countries. There are a lot of issues with that. So this is what we look at, this whole core periphery model. When it comes to development, doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do it. And look for examples as I keep going through this, and again as you watch that film. All right, now with development, like with a lot of stuff, you get a lot of data, and we'll see examples of this throughout. And data can be useful; they can also be meaningless. It's a lot of it depends on who's taking, doing the survey, who's administering the survey, who's gathering the data, if they're doing it properly, if they're asking all the right questions. So we'll see a lot of this stuff. Sometimes it's questionable, but this right here, like we don't even have to question it. This is kind of a good, just kind of general starting point to think about how we who study this stuff think about development. And so this is from the United Nations. We're going to talk about the UN, specifically the origin of the UN and what they do and what they're there for, and all that later on. But when it comes to development, they do a lot of work in terms of just gathering data. All right? And so what this is showing is that we have on the left, we had in the orange colors here, it's showing children born in the year 2000 in low human development countries. And we'll get into the UN's Human Development Index. A lot of terms. There are a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of numbers. Just go with it. All right? I'm not going to be a jerk like on the final exam and just test you on acronyms or whatever. Because if it's online, you can Google that, and so that's meaningless. And B, it's kind of meaningless anyway. People get too hung up on some of these exact terms that people just made up a handful of years ago. So don't worry about the details here. But low human development, it means it's our poor countries, right? What we would call developing. Third world is the term that had traditionally been used. We try to get away from it because third world is quite the derogatory term. And if you think like, oh, it doesn't sound so bad, it's because you're not from a third world country. You haven't had to be, told this over and over. Chances are, you grew up in the United States, or you're the leader, you're the best. So yeah, third world we don't like. Developing or global south, which I've discussed before. That's one I tend to use. So children born in the year 2000 in the global south. So what orange is showing. Blue, children born in 2000 in the global north, in the wealthy countries, right? So just because, math and percentage and all that works in 100s, you can think of this as actual percent, or you can think for every 100 kids or whatever, right? That's what they're showing. So we take all the kids born in these global south countries on the global north, and then they're looking at where these kids are, right? In the global south, 3%, or 3 out of 100 kids would be in higher education, would actually go to college, right? And so this is based in the year 2000. This is from the 2019 report. So it's the idea of like watching kids grow up who were born right at the millennium, right? So three would make it to college, and then 55 in the global north would actually make it to college. So a big discrepancy there. And now one thing you could ask too is, how important is higher education for all 100 of these students? And that's a whole different debate. We don't need to assume like not every single person needs to go get an associate's or a bachelor's degree or a master's or a PhD or whatever it might be. We never really seem to have that question. We just like to kind of push this idea of college is good, and then we're kind of like shocked why all these people with college degrees can't get jobs and all the stuff we hear all the time. So apart from that, you can see clearly your chances of going on and getting some kind of college degree a lot less in the global south than in the north. And then we drop down and it shows that 80 of those kids in the global south are not in higher education. And you could quickly do some math and you can say that's not 100, but that's because 17 of those kids died before the age of 20, didn't make it to that point where they could even go on to college, right? Whereas you look at with the global north, like the US, England, Japan, wherever we're talking about, 55 are in higher education, 44 not there, and one died before the age of 20. So it just paints a very different picture about how successful kids are going to be if they're born in country X versus country Y. Right? So it does one clear thing right here that this shows, and we'll continue to talk about, is the idea that geography, of course, matters. Right? Nations matter. And when we get into globalization, we'll talk about, like in the 90s, a lot of people thought it was hip to say, like, there's no more history, there's no more geography, we're just this one beautiful global futuristic world. And that's nonsense. It's like what I was talking about last time, where we get into this post-industrial era and we envision our cities are all clean and life is just wonderful and we're making progress. And what we don't think about is the fact that we moved all the dirty stuff elsewhere, right? It didn't go away, it just went to some other place. And that's the same idea with this stuff here. Place matters. Where you're born certainly does matter. Now, some people will debate that, and we'll look at some of those debates in a future lecture, but this is the general idea with development. Place matters. Let's try to make it, though, so place doesn't matter by making everybody equal, right? Or giving kids an equal chance of success, however you want to phrase it. All right, and just going back to the global south, global north division, I think I showed this image before. Just want to make sure we're clear. Global north would be those countries in the blue. And when this line was originally drawn, like South Africa didn't get lumped in with the global north. Australia and New Zealand, I think, were still there. But it's the idea that there was a line drawn between the wealthy countries and the poor countries. And for the most part, the wealthy countries were all well in the northern hemisphere. The poor ones were south. Right? That's the idea. So the red indicates much poorer countries. Those we think of as less developed or developing or whatever. And here's some more of this acronym stuff, just so it's clear. So an MDC is used to describe a more developed country, and you have more developed and less developed. That sounds, it's kind of a softer, gentler way of describing things. More developed, less developed. It sounds nicer than rich and poor. That's the idea. But it is good to know, and this goes back to that uneven development core periphery thing, that of all the countries, and you're around 200 countries that exist in the world that are, actual countries. There's some disputes and all that, but we just round it to 200. Of those, about 20% make up this wealthy nation, the global north, the more developed countries. And therefore, 80% of the remaining countries, a huge amount, are considered to be poor, right, at different levels, or what we would call less developed. Right? So you can see this is why development is so important. It's that so many people around the world live in what we consider to be less developed conditions. And we'll get into why that is and why these things exist. We'll continue to talk about it. And then there's another term down here, an NIC, or newly industrializing country. That's seen as a transition from the LDC to the MDC, right? These poor countries who are trying, they're doing the work, and they're getting better, but they're still not quite, more developed, but they're not a full on, impoverished, the classic idea of the third world country. And newly industrializing, we see this in like Asia. It's brought up a lot for those countries that they're doing well from an economic standpoint, but they're not seen as being up in that more developed country status, right? And one that students bring up quite often is the condition of China, which we see here is firmly in that global south. India as well. They may, like China has, and we'll talk about GDP later, but they've got a massive GDP. One that's well higher than some of these other blue countries that exist. In fact, most of these blue countries that exist, but still, we lump them into this less developed, or we say they're newly industrializing, and that's cute too. The idea of newly industrializing, even though it's this ancient empire and been around for a while and all that, but it's some of it. It gets down to the pure data, and the other thing, quite often, it's I don't want to use the race card in here, but there's a definite othering that goes on where a lot of these nations, and they're not all lumped into this category. South Korea and Japan are part of the club, but there's some of these other ones where it just seems like it's really hard for development people to bring them into the club, to let them be in the global north for whatever reason. Yeah, so a lot of this stuff, it's kind of silly, some of these divisions, but it's still, there's a lot of truth to the idea that not 80% of the countries that are out there, they're not doing as well as they could be. And that's what we want to fix one way or another. Okay, now with these developing countries, or those in the global south, there's a list, and you don't need to memorize these, but it's just a list of what we tend to see in these countries. Like, how can we tell that a country is in the global north or the global south? Right? And you can just go down here and see, the first one, widespread poverty / malnutrition. You got a lot of poor people. So, the poverty line is that idea of if you make less than this amount of money throughout the year, you're, in poverty, you're impoverished. And if you make above that, well, then you're out of poverty. You're doing okay, right, in theory, right? And so it's the idea where most of the country would be living below the poverty line, not getting enough food to eat, enough nutrition and all that, as opposed to here. And, you can debate all of this stuff, but just this idea of widespread poverty, we don't see it in the same way as we'd see in these developing countries. The agriculture thing, let's just skip that because that's problematic. Pronounced dualism, it's the idea that we've got super elite, super poor, no real middle class, and so on. Yeah, we've talked about some of this stuff, like the underutilization of labor. We talked about the Arab Spring at some point, and the idea of being over educated, so where you have that college degree, but you can't do anything with it, right? It's not really helpful, and that could also, maybe influence the reason why, if we go back to the original data graphic that we're looking at, why you don't see as many people going to college in some of these countries. Maybe it's kind of useless to do that. And we've seen this growth here in a country like the US, where more and more people are going to try to get college degrees. But then there's a question of the growing, uselessness of that. If you get that degree, great, but you can't get a job other than like some kind of retail thing or driving for Uber or whatever. Like, why go get that degree, right? So all of this stuff, we can see any 1 through 9. You can make a case that we have this happening in a place like the U.S. The difference, though, is the degree at which it is happening. And you could also say, again, this is the problem when you start thinking about this stuff too much. You see that some of these simple lists, like, see, if I were a really good teacher of this, like, intro to geography stuff, I wouldn't question any of this. I would just read these out to you guys and make you memorize them. It would be good. But I'm just like, I'm looking through, like, 8, environmental degradation. Yeah, we got that. Here we don't tend to think of it in the same way. But climate change and carbon emissions and all of that, we're leading to that heavily. It might not be as visible here, because again, I think I talked about last time, we ship that stuff over to China, so a lot of the visible pollution is happening there. But it's happening there because we're paying them to have it happen there, so we can import goods or whatever, right? So, okay, look, you know what? This list is bullshit. Read through. Hopefully it makes sense, but don't get too hung up on this. This is here's my thesis. Here's the real issue I have with a lot of this stuff, is that we try to make this development fit these different categories and just have checklists, and if we check all the boxes, we're good, we've developed a country or whatever. It's way messier than that, which all of this stuff is way messier than that, but this is the general idea. All right, so there you go. Let's move on. Okay, now this is worth talking about. This is good stuff. We tend to have 2 different ways in which we can deal with development. How can we raise that standard of living across the world? We have either the fight against poverty or the analysis of long-term economic and social development. Now, of those 2, which one's the sexy one? Which one do you want to do? Do you want to fight against poverty? Or do you want to analyze some data, put some stuff into Excel, and get some charts and see what's going on? Of course, you want to fight against poverty. Like, if nothing else, that's a good way to get chicks, right? If fellas who are listening, like, if you're really, this is a big part of college for the young man, is you're trying, as you're going through and you're learning about this stuff, you try to project this idea of, oh man, poverty stinks, I want to fight against it, and then you hope that other people you are sexually interested in will look at you and go like, oh, he is so dreamy. Yeah, I get it. And quite often we say this stuff doesn't actually mean anything or do anything. And so with it, and this is something that with that whole Poverty Incorporated documentary, they're questioning some of this fight against poverty, these very short-term things that are hip, they're fashionable stuff. It's like where you have a product in the store and on the tag or a sign, it says like, portions of the proceeds of this product will go to help, starving children in Africa, or whatever it says, right? And you're like, well, shoot, I don't want to have children starving in Africa, so I'll buy this shirt and not this one. And the other good thing is I'm wearing a shirt that like says that I care, that I'm fighting against poverty, right? So you can feel good. It's nice and all, but honestly, the big problem with this stuff is we throw some money at it, at whatever problem it is, and we don't follow up, right? We don't question if it's still working. And this is one good thing from the documentary that they bring up, is this just the simple idea that we've been fighting against poverty for decades now, and we're not winning the fight. It seems to just keep going. And it's almost like, if we just spend just a little bit more money, we'll finally do it, and everybody will have, cars and jobs and cell phones and all that stuff. But we just need a little more money. We need to question, like, what is this money doing? Where is it going? Why isn't it helping? What's at work? So this feels good. I'm not going to deny that. And I've done stuff like this. I don't do these kinds of things anymore. simply because I don't think it helps. And again, I'll talk about the documentary at a later date. We'll get into the why it doesn't help, what the problem is, and then also, what is a solution or what do we need to do? Which sadly, and that's the problem with this, is that sadly the actual solution to global poverty, these developing countries that have that low standard of living, the solution isn't a simple, okay, just do this, just buy this thing instead of this thing, and we're good. No, it actually means we need to fundamentally change our own system. We need to fundamentally change, the economy here, the way globalization is itself set up. It's like the whole system's on trial. It's the whole thing doesn't work. And we'll talk globalization. We'll get into more of this stuff. So this feels good in that instant when you spend $1, to help starving kids or whatever. Doesn't work. Doesn't actually do anything to permanently get rid of that problem. Okay? That's the problem there. So clearly, if the fight against poverty isn't good, well then, how about that long-term analysis, right, of economic data and trends and all that's got to work, right? No, that's garbage too. So that's the thing. Like both of these approaches are used by different camps, or sometimes it's the same camp. You have one group that is doing long-term analysis, in conjunction with those who are doing that kind of immediate throwing money, doing the charity, the aid projects. Neither really work, because the idea with the long-term approach is that you're studying trends in developed nations, less developed nations, trying to get a sense of, okay, if the U.S., is this global superpower, if we have the largest GDP, I didn't know exactly what that means, but we can effectively say, if we have the largest economy in the world, well, what did we do? How did we get here? And then knowing that, like, let's have these other countries do that stuff. If Haiti is so poor, well, then just make them do some U.S. stuff, and then they'll make money too, and we'll be cool, right? And that doesn't always work. And we have, like, there are cultural reasons why this doesn't work, or like what happened in Europe doesn't necessarily work in, wherever, like the Middle East, okay? Or just the Muslim world in general. I mean, there are issues, there are cultural and religious issues, like with the Quran and with Islam. The idea of interest is forbidden. You're not supposed to like give somebody a loan but charge interest on it and have that come back, right? Now in Christian Europe, like that's awesome. In the U.S., oh, we love that, right? I mean that's one of the biggest scams. I love them with student loans, which avoid those for as long as you possibly can, folks. Make good choices here because they do last forever. Let me tell you. But with these things, we get money from the government. Let's say if we don't even go to a private bank, we can borrow money because tuition and living expenses. It's going to be whatever, 10,000, 20,000 a semester, if we're lucky, with stuff. So we take out that loan, and the government, lets us have that money, but we start accruing interest on it. It's going back to the government. The government's making money off of us, but we don't actually question it, even though the idea is we should be the investment as the students, to help make society work or whatever. But it's how we are. Charging interest, as American as apple pie, right? Not the case in the Muslim world. Now, from what I understand, there are plenty of ways around this that you just don't call it interest. You call it something else, like a fee, I guess. I don't know exactly. It's just what some Muslim folks I've talked to have said. Like, this is how it works in countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia and all that. So, but still, it's just there's a clear cultural difference connected to money and making money and economics, right? So that's an issue that we need to be aware of. Another issue is that in this long-term analysis, if we're studying countries like the U.S. is wealthy, Britain's wealthy, France, all these different countries were wealthy today because of industrialization, and some industrialization that really polluted the world, made some problems for the global climate, but we had to do what we had to do. But then we try to get other countries to do this stuff, and we're not actually helping the global ecosystem, itself. So that can be an issue. And then finally, too, which is the case with a place like Haiti, um, we also have to question, like, maybe the reason why we in the U.S. are doing well and those folks in Haiti aren't doing well isn't because Haiti just needs to try harder or whatever. Maybe it's actually there have been some policies where we in the U.S. kind of screwed Haiti in an effort to try to, make our own money, right? And we start to see that uneven development isn't simply these countries figured it out and worked harder and these ones haven't. It's actually that 20% on the top, they got there by climbing up over those 80% on the bottom. All right, so, and then we'll see examples of that. And so that's a big issue. And that's one of the things why this doesn't work. And if we really are serious about studying this stuff, we need to kind of start looking at our own policies, question what we in the global north have done to ensure our own high standard of living, and then have a real long talk about, are we okay with that, ethically, is this something we ought to do, like it's okay, or is there some issue where no, we should we need to stop doing this if we and therefore actually help everybody, even if it means some folks in this country their standard of living goes down, right? And I say some folks their standard of living, it's not. There's a lot of class. I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of class questions that have to be asked here as well. All right, so those are the two approaches. Neither of them work, and there's a reason for that, as I just got into, but still, that's what's going on, okay, with development and what we'll continue to see. Now, in terms of determining who's developed and who isn't, the traditional way of doing this has been through GDP, or gross domestic product, which is a fancy way of saying the total value of goods and services in a country. All right, that's what we're measuring. We're measuring the economy, effectively, the wealth of a nation, and quite often we'll do GDP per capita, where we take that whole wealth, divide it by the people in the country, and we get some number that it just kind of helps us measure against other countries. So it's a good way to compare, because you might have a high GDP in this country, a low one here, but it turns out you have a lot more people in this first country, and that's why the GDP is higher than the second country, right? But dividing it by the amount of people in the country, the idea is it's more meaningful. The problem, though, is that goods and services aren't. It's not everything in terms of being fully developed, and we can think of development and a high standard of living. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to have a lot of money. You want to have a good life, right? You want to have good things in your life that may be related to money, maybe not, right? We also know too, this whole per capita idea, taking the total value, each year, dividing it by the amount of people in the country for that year, sounds great, but no country actually does that, right? Like, we have the highest GDP per capita here in the United States, but we don't take the economy, like at the end of the year, we don't take all the wealth, throw it together, divide it evenly across the population, right? So that can be kind of meaningless. We don't get a sense of, what's that gap between the super wealthy and the super poor. We don't get a sense if there's a middle class or not. We're just getting this kind of, basic number. So GDP was very popular after World War II, up until, the 90s, where there started to be a lot of pushback, it seems. And the UN has tried their own way of measuring development through this concept of the Human Development Index, or HDI. Right? And so it's where we take GDP, so actual wealth is something there, but they also add in life expectancy and education in there. And even that's not perfect, but it still gives you a sense of, literacy rates and how highly educated a population is, as well as how healthy they are, All right, because if the life expectancy is higher, in this country and lower in this one, it's there's a good chance that it's because there isn't a lot of access to health care for those people who are dying early on. Or there's some other health related issue that needs to be addressed. All right, so the UN put this together in an effort to get away from just relying on GDP. This is from early on. They actually pulled this out as an example from one of their early reports, and it was so we've got the HDI on the left, GDP per capita on the right, and it's in U.S. dollars. And the PPP thing is it's trying to link everything to use exchange rate differences and get rid of those and just put it in U.S. dollars with the idea that the cost of living is the same and all of that, right? So we can look at those numbers on the right, and they mean the same thing. Now with the HDI, the U.S. and France tie at this 0.95. You can think of that as like 95%. That's just the index here. It's you go from 0 to 1. 1 would be perfect. Nobody scored that. I think like Denmark got like a 98. That was the most developed. But everybody in the global north was in the 90s, I'm pretty sure. And we tied with France. Okay, that's, fine, no big deal. But then, if you actually go over and look at GDP itself, we see that actually the US doing a lot better than France in terms of GDP, meaning like we are a much wealthier nation here in the US when compared to France. And based on that actually makes the fact that we tied with France awful because, GDP was taken into account. So we actually scored higher than France in the GDP camp, but they clearly did better in terms of life expectancy and education and all that. So you could ask the question, what exactly are we paying for here, right? And that's the real question, and why we push at just a pure focus on economics in terms of, money coming in, money going out, and all that, and these just very simple numbers doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening for the people themselves who are living in that specific country. All right, so we should question like, hey, all right, we got all this money, but we're not living any better than people in France are. What are we doing? Are we being inefficient with our money? Or is it a case of not everybody has access to that money, or therefore, access to healthcare and education expenses and stuff like that? That's what we should question. And we never really did that after this, because instead we just say greatest country in the world, and we leave it at that, like we're afraid that we might find out that we could learn something from a European country or whatever. But that's the question we should have been asking. Maybe you guys can take charge of that and ask that yourselves. This was a similar study, but this one done just in the United States itself. And you can now, if you click this link I put in here, it'll take you to a new one that's more dynamic. So this was an older one around the same time that UN thing we just looked at was released. And it's a choropleth map, so it's based on congressional districts. And it's showing, based on that, if the district is darker in color, it's a lovely color scheme. But the darker brown right here, they are more developed, and the lighter yellowish, tannish color here is less developed, right? So that's how we read this. And clearly they have a different scale on this from that 0 to 1 thing the UN was using. Don't really worry about the numbers, just it's the idea that the darker colors, like we see Connecticut, not bad, right? Everybody there doing okay. And then Mississippi, Mississippi always looks like that. And I say that with love of this place. I got family there. I got family in Louisiana, which is not much better than Mississippi. Beautiful people, beautiful culture, and great food, and horrible climate. Too humid, but still wonderful place. When it comes to living long and reading, nope, not doing so well. Right? So that's how we read this. Now, do you have any idea where the most developed congressional district is? Because we've got, this dark brown here and here and in California, of course, and throughout New England, like it's all over the country. But which district here scored the highest? Any thoughts? I'll pause while you shout at your computer or phone as you play along. It was, hopefully, you guessed New York City, specifically the congressional district that makes up Manhattan. They scored the highest, right? Of course, Manhattan, like they're doing fine. And this was before like the big Great Recession that we had, 2007, 2008. So it's, everything is growing and growing. They're still doing fine. These folks doing fine. So you would think, maybe you thought, it's here in California, it's Silicon Valley, somewhere in LA County, Malibu, Santa Barbara, something like that. No, we're doing fine. But it was Manhattan. They scored the highest. Now, what about the lowest? Who is the least developed in terms of American congressional districts, in this case specifically in 2005? Any thoughts? You're probably shouting, it's Mississippi because he just made fun of them or whatever. No. I mean, it's rough here in the South. No. Right? You might think like New Mexico. Here we've got a lot of Native American territory, the Navajo Nation. No, it's in California. I forget exactly which one of these it is. I think it's this guy here, but it's in the Central Valley, where we just scored the lowest in terms of, again, wealth, but also life expectancy, education. Central Valley of California, we're dealing with a lot of, farm workers, people who are out in the field in awful conditions, as well. I mean, just the Central Valley itself. If you've been through there, you've seen it. It feels radically different from other parts of the state. Right? A lot of poverty there. There's a lot of wealth there in terms of they're quite often corporations who own the farmland itself. And of course, a lot of those corporations, they're not like technically headquartered there. The people who own it don't live there. They live down in LA or whatever. But still, it's you got a lot of wealth, but it's not really held there, right? And that's pretty disturbing, and that's always a valid question that people bring up. This idea of, okay, we're talking about, helping to develop these other countries, but what about people here? We got tons of people living in poverty here in this country. Shouldn't we fix that stuff first? And again, I'm not here to tell you exactly what to do, even though I probably do that every other sentence, if you're really listening. It's a question that has validity in terms of asking it. And I would think if you really ask that and you look at the poverty here, you also look at poverty elsewhere, again, it's this system-wide thing where we really need to think about, how this money is flowing and all of that. That would be the way to get at it. Now, I recently, as I was putting this stuff together, put it online, I went to the current website where this stuff is and looking at it. It looks like when I last checked, California had both the most developed and least developed. I think Silicon Valley took the top spot from Manhattan, and it's still like Fresno or Merced or wherever has the lowest developed area. And that's even more staggering, right? The idea that we have the best place to live, the most developed place, if you want to think of it that way, not only wealthiest, but healthiest and most educated, and we have the least of all of those things, not too far away from that. Something to think about. Now, with all of this, we've got the HDI. The UN has a lot of reports they put out. Another source of data for development, and I'm not going to, in some of my other classes, I show this to students. We play around with it. I'm not going to do that. You guys are welcome to do this, but I'll talk about the World Bank at more length in a little bit. But if you're, just do this. Go to this spot because this is a great resource for just college papers and just little projects and stuff like that you'll have in other classes. So if you click on this, go to this spot with the World Bank. You can go in. There are all these indicators that are different things like carbon emissions or percentage of women in higher education, compared to men or stuff like that. We can find all of this. You can map it, In fact, that's what I used when I was doing the agriculture thing and looking at CO2 production between the U.S. and then these places where they have slash and burn agriculture, right? And showing how the U.S. we might not do the slash and burn, we pollute way more, and trying to show that it's silly for us to point fingers at some of these nations for these practices we don't like, because it's not having this massive effect on the planet like what we do here is having, right? I was able to quickly go in there, pull up a map, take a screenshot, throw it into Google Slides, right? Real easy, and it makes papers or presentations or whatever you're doing, it just makes it look way more slick when you do that. And you can download the data in an Excel file and do stuff there. There's a lot you can do. So I just bring this up as it's a resource that students can use to just kind of augment and enhance stuff you have to do. And might be, I mean, as long as you do it right, could be the difference between getting a C or a B or an A on that project, that presentation, that whatever. All right, so you can check that out. And as I said, we'll talk about what the World Bank is a little more in a moment. Now, here's another thing, just while we're doing data and fun with data. This came from a UN report, I want to say in the late 90s. And since then, it's gone into all sorts of geography textbooks and development textbooks and stuff like that. You can kind of see it everywhere, mainly because it's fun to look at. I haven't found anything quite updated. Like I said, this was the late 90s when this came out with the numbers, actually reflect and all that. But it's showing global priority on the left, and then the amount of money in US dollars in billions on the right. So, like every year in the US, we spend $8 billion on cosmetics. Right? And again, it's, from the 90s, we get that. I'm not going to keep, justifying everything and adjusting and putting in that stuff. That's what we're referring to. So 8 billion cosmetics, 11 billion on ice cream in Europe alone. Perfume, which I guess isn't technically a cosmetic. I don't know what the distinctions are there. But perfumes in Europe and the U.S., 12 billion. Pet food in Europe and the U.S., 17 billion. That's one thing I always love, right? When we have people starving, and we have to have schools up during like the whole COVID-19 thing to make sure, because some kids don't get food unless they actually go to school. Yet when it comes to our little pooches, we will spend whatever we need to keep them, healthy. All right, pep talk over. Business entertainment in Japan. Think about that how you will. 35 billion. Cigarettes in Europe, 50. Alcoholic drinks in Europe, 105. I bet we beat them. But we don't have that. Narcotics in the world, globally, 400 billion a year. That's a lot of cocaine, right? That is a lot of cocaine. Something to think about. In fact, if your cocaine bill is too high, switch to booze, because I don't think you'll spend as much. Maybe not. I guess that's just Europe. I don't know. Okay. But then to top it all off, military spending in the world, almost $800 billion. Again, based on these 1990s numbers, right? And I'll bet you it says 780 billion in the world. We probably spend like 779 billion of that in this country alone. Okay, so this is all money. It's going out into the economy for all this different stuff. And then the next one, again, global priority and the cost here. So basic education for all. To do this around the world, it would cost $6 billion. Water and sanitation for all, $9 billion. Reproductive health for all women, $12 billion. And just basic health and nutrition globally, $13 billion. Okay? So those numbers, pretty small. When we go back to this, you can see we spend a lot of money on stuff that, sure, is fun. Like, who doesn't love good business entertainment when you're in Japan? But then when you look at this, hopefully what this does is it gives you pause, right? That you think, oh my God, that doesn't seem that expensive. And in light, like I don't know what the numbers are today, but with that first stimulus package here, the U.S. spent $2 trillion to deal with COVID-19, with all of the sheltering in place and the quarantining and all of that stuff. 2 trillion. Yeah, we can do that. This seems pretty tiny in comparison, right? Like you guys listening, you AVC students, I know, come on, I can tell, all your drugs that you guys do, and these are narcotics, like the weed stuff. It doesn't actually count here, although don't do that either. Save money on that. Stick to booze. That's way healthier. But just think about that. Like if you do coke, which I assume, of my students, like at least 70% do cope with it, with some amount of regularity. All I'm saying is ease up on that, right? Don't do as much cocaine. Cut back. It'll be great for your heart and that nasal sound in your voice. So it'll be good there. You probably sleep better if you cut back as well. But just think about that. Like as you're setting up a line of cocaine, try to use the right lingo that you cokeheads would use. When you're gonna take a bump or whatever, like pause and say, hey, maybe I should slow down on this and take the money I would spend on all my cocaine and put it into clean water for people around the world. Are you with me? You're not with me, little cokeheads. Yeah. Well, okay. So the numbers here, it is staggering when you think about how much is spent on the first graph, and then how much could be spent to actually help people out in the second one. But then the other question too is like, okay, let's say, in fact, right here, we could add all this up and still, with military spend. Let's say, keep doing your drugs. If you're doing your drugs, keep doing them. Let's instead make the military cut back. Let's buy a few less, bombers and tanks and stuff like that a year. Let's, save up the, 40, 50 billion a year, whatever, that we need to spend to do all of this stuff. Let's do that. And we send the money out, and then everybody can be healthy and educated, like people can read and all that stuff. That sounds pretty good, right? The problem, though, with that is that if we, to simply, like, first, like, who gets the money, right? Who's in charge of this stuff? Like, who is in charge of making sure that everybody gets their stuff? That's a big problem. Whether it's something like the UN, some global entity coming out and making sure, okay, we're going to set up these school programs and stuff like that. That can be quite paternalistic. It's a term I mentioned with the paternalism ideas. I was setting the stage for the Poverty Incorporated. The idea of like a parent, telling a child what to do. We don't necessarily want some elite global institution going around and just telling other countries, other people what education actually means or what health actually means or, whatever. Okay, so there's that. There's also the case that, okay, maybe we just send money to the different countries. And the first issue with that is you think of all the, different corrupt dictators that exist, and a lot of these countries that are suffering the most are, suffering because the person in charge is causing them to suffer, and that helps this person stay in power. And so why would this person want to make sure everybody gets, reproductive health or whatever it might be, right? So just the administration is difficult. But also the other thing, and this is what, again, I keep going back to that documentary, but as you watch it, it gets into the issue of, what charity, like if we in the U.S. are to give this money to these other countries, what quite often happens is despite all the money that's going in, it doesn't actually help the people it needs to help, right? Even if it gets to the people, it's not actually fixing the greater system that has allowed these folks to, live in poverty, to not have health and nutrition and reproductive rights and all that stuff, right? So the real thing here is when it comes to just throwing money at a problem, that's a very American thing. It's something we love to do. It's not quite that simple, right? So this is worth thinking about how, if we're really serious about it, how cheap it would be to help other people in other countries. But at the same time, it's not as simple as writing a check and going from there, right? Just think about that. All right, now I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to get into how did we get to this moment in time in which we have this mighty, American economy here. We're this global superpower, highest GDP, how we have these different wealthy nations, and now we have these poor nations. And so, and what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be stealing a lot of this stuff, if not all of it, I don't know, from Neil Smith, who was a geographer. He sadly passed away a few years ago, but a brilliant human geographer, critical geographer, and specifically, what I'm looking at here, it's two books: American Empire, which is a giant, scary-looking book, and then The Endgame of Globalization, which is a much smaller, much easier to read book, both working toward the same idea of how the U.S. came to be like what it is today. Okay, and so that's like one of the different analysis of these historical events. I'm pulling from Smith's work, because he was a brilliant guy, and the book Endgame of Globalization influenced me a lot myself. I read that in grad school and thought it was crazy. I kicked myself too, because after I read that, I was at a conference and I actually wound up in a bar with Neil Smith, and it was kind of sad. Well, I'll just leave it at that. You can Google if you want. But at the same time, I was too much of a chicken to talk to him. To go, oh, I'm Professor Smith. I liked your book. And then, I never ran into him again, and he died. And so just there's a lesson. If you see somebody you actually want to engage in conversation with, do it, right? Even if I probably would have sounded like the biggest moron. He could have been a total dick to me. I don't know. But I kind of rather have that story of like, oh, he's a real dick, than to always wonder. Better to regret, right? Something you did than something you didn't do. So, okay, that aside, we're going to talk some Neil Smith here. And what he's looking at is this period of time. Really, he's looking at the 20th century. I mean, we can just chalk it up right there. Where by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, we're doing pretty well in terms of growth and production, and just we got all these resources. We can make stuff. We've had our industrial revolution, and so our economy is growing. But we get a little stagnant because we're not a real empire in the sense of how, say, Britain, or France or any of these other, empires, these Western European empires were in the 19th century, and beyond. Well, going back 1492, right? From there up until this point, you've got these European countries that are going around and taking land all over the globe. America doesn't do that in quite the same way, primarily because all this land was already taken by the time the United States has the independence as well as the power to go and do that, right? Because if you think about it, if you read your history, we were one of those spots where that land was taken, right? We're British, we're colonies, so that's what we kind of miss the boat when it comes to taking land. And one of the useful things, and of course I'm saying this in a very clinical way, like I don't think it's great to go out and steal land from brown people. Yeah, I'm willing to be quoted on that. I'm saying that into a video on YouTube. Don't, put this in your notes, don't steal land from brown people. Yeah, I'm woke. No, I mean that. Yeah, I'm just saying it clinically. So clearly, it's a bad thing. But the great thing about stealing land from brown people is that once you have that land, like if you're Britain, and so around this time they own a quarter of the world, they have this land, but they also therefore control markets. There's not a global economy like we think of it today. If you are British, whether you're in London or you're in some colonial territory, you're in India or wherever, you're buying stuff from British companies, right? That's the idea. You are buying things that are British in nature. You're not buying stuff from American companies or French companies or whatever. It's all controlled. It's all happening within the empire. Okay? Now, the U.S., without having our colonies, like we've got some islands, and There are a lot of issues with that. That's a discussion for another time in terms of what happens in Puerto Rico, American Samoa, these kinds of places. But so we don't have these massive markets at all. So we're kind of stuck when it comes to our economic, growth. What we can do economically. Thank goodness World War I happens, right? Those Europeans all fussy, they start fighting and killing each other, and it takes us a while to get into the war, but eventually we do, and we're on the winning side, so it works out. And Woodrow Wilson is our president during this period, and what Neil Smith is arguing here is that really Wilson, he wants to get us into the war because he knows that it's going to be a good opportunity for us, right? And so he gives this 14-point speech. We don't need to dwell on it. He proposes the League of Nations. Get into what that is, but really it's the idea that we've won the war, or the winning side. We now have the right, as being on the winning team, to help shift and shape what happens after the war. Okay, what does this new reality look like? Again, and I've mentioned this a few times, so in my different classes, but it's whenever you have some kind of crisis moment, the idea is, okay, everything's falling apart, and then if you are willing and able, you can, seize on that crisis, stop the damage, whether it's war, or say a pandemic, or a depression, or, whatever it might be, and then after it, change things so that life is better afterwards, right? And that life is better, that's a loaded value judgment. That can mean different things, but that's the idea here. The war happens, it's a tragic, horrible thing, but the idea is after the war, let's change stuff, right? The League of Nations itself, this was the predecessor to the United Nations. I think it sounds way cooler, right? The League of Nations. And the idea was, let's have these countries come together and talk about their feelings rather than shoot each other, right? Let's not have a World War II. Could you imagine a second World War? No, thank you. So we set it up so we won't have a second World War. One issue was the U.S. never actually joined the League of Nations, and it was a congressional thing. Like Wilson wanted us to. Congress didn't, because the idea was, like, let's just say there is a second World War. Well, God, if we're in the League of Nations, we're going to have to go fight in that second World War, right? So let's hope, even if there is a second World War, the U.S. can stay out of it and not have to go in and fight, right? It's cute to look at this stuff, knowing, what's going to happen a few years later. But it's the idea that there are a lot of folks in the United States that don't want to be connected to all of this European global stuff that's going on. It's the idea of being an isolationist. We learned that term early on in high school, hopefully, if not junior high. That isolationist idea of we here in the U.S., we just want to be left alone, do our stuff. I don't care what's happening in China or Russia or France or Zimbabwe, wherever. Just doing my own thing here, right? And that was the prevailing attitude, especially after World War I, having so many people die and have this horrible thing go on. Of course, a lot of people in the United States said, no, let the Europeans figure this stuff out. We don't want to have any part of it. Right? So this is one reason why the League wasn't that successful, why we did have a second World War, because the U.S. was hands off with this stuff. Now, the idea, and again, pulling from Smith, so Woodrow Wilson, his whole idea is let's go into World War I so we can have a say in terms of how the world looks afterwards. Okay? And so we've got the League of Nations. We put this thing into place. And this way, we don't have wars breaking out, but also we can start to open up some of these markets, right? We can start to get the U.S. economy growing and becoming more global so we can make some more money. So we can be doing quite well for ourselves, right? So it's a cynical, read on this. But if you know anything about Woodrow Wilson, the guy was not fantastic. You can Google Woodrow Wilson and, KKK. Do that. That's a hoot. Playing the birth of a nation in the White House and all that. He was a flaming racist. Not even with modern presidents where we say they're racist. But it's about like what's said between the lines or whatever. No, like this guy was full on racist, white supremacist kind of guy. Woodrow Wilson, one of our presidents. So yeah, he was not the greatest guy. You could see him being, in it for himself, in it for his own country. And he also, through all of this stuff, he kept proposing self-determination, meaning like, sovereignty, or the idea that of these, and he would call smaller nations, meaning colonial outposts, different, colonies around the world, kept saying that the people themselves should have the opportunity to, you know, have sovereignty, to make their own nations, to no longer be a colony. And of course, he's saying this. There's no evidence to show that he's actually doing anything to make it happen. This guy, well, you guys know who's on the screen right now, right? Who is that? Oh, come on. That's Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho. So he's the leader of the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. Okay, the bad guy, the enemy, the leader of Charlie, that guy. He came to France to meet with Wilson and the good guys, the people who are fixing the world and all that, because he's hearing Wilson talk about self determination. He wants to meet with Wilson, isn't allowed to, and France was the colonial power in Vietnam at the time, so he doesn't get to actually talk about this stuff. Winds up, having that insurgency that against the French, and then eventually the Americans, and leads to the whole mess that is the Vietnam War. It's just kind of one of those amazing moments in history where you wonder, like, what would have happened? What could have changed if Wilson could have even just, talked to the guy in the first place, let alone maybe considered that yeah, we should this whole enslaving other people around the world, maybe not the best thing, right? But he didn't do that. W.B. Du Bois also came to say like, hey, well, you're talking about these other nations, African Americans. We don't have our own self determination, so maybe we could do that. Yeah, he didn't. No, again, Klansman Woodrow Wilson did not talk to any folks about African American situations here in this country, let alone other people around the world. Right? So this whole cynical read, this is why I go along with it, because Wilson himself, like you can see in both the actions themselves of not meeting with these people, as well as just who this guy was, you can see how it really, yeah, this was a lot of talk, but it was really to get these economic markets opening up. Okay? And it's also, and this is, Smith's read of what's going on, and I think it makes a lot of sense. It's that true global power doesn't come from taking land, right? It's not going in and setting up colonies here and there and like ultimately taking over the world. Like for anybody, I don't know if any of you guys want to be like a supervillain when you get older, but as you're doing that, as you're going through and coming up with your evil plan, don't plan to take over the world through like controlling land. That's stupid and it doesn't work. But you know what you do? You focus on economic markets, right? If you can control the global economy, then great, have your stupid land. I don't need it. I got your money, right? That's the kind of idea. So he's reading it as really what Wilson is doing, and this whole idea. And it's not everybody in the U.S., but the folks who want to go in to the war, who want to go in and not only win it for a good cause, but like help reshape stuff after. The whole idea is to take over the global economy, or at least get more into it, so that the United States has some more power, right? So we can actually start to become a superpower as we think of ourselves today. We haven't always been like this. We haven't always been the richest country, the most powerful country, had the biggest military, any of that stuff. We had to work to get to this point, right? And this is one such moment where that work was being done. Then we have World War II. Okay? So, yeah, shocker, another war breaks out. The Germans are not happy with the fact that, life sucks. After World War One, it allows the Nazis to take power in there. And then we have, the story. We got World War II. The U.S., again, doesn't want to enter. It's World War One still fresh in the minds of a lot of Americans. Don't want to have to do it. Pearl Harbor happens. we got to do it. We got to start moving in. And so we enter the war. And this time, Wilson is long gone. We're now dealing with FDR. Roosevelt is, leading us in here. And again, it's a case of not just, going to fight the good fight and to stop those evil Nazis, but look, we win this thing. We can, again, reshape the world. We can keep tweaking economic stuff. All right, that's the idea. And so we do win the war, our allied forces. So the big three are the U.S., us, the United Kingdom, or Britain or England, however you want to look at it. We don't need to go. It all kind of means the same thing, but England is a country in Great Britain, which is Wales and Scotland, and then we get Northern Ireland in there to make the United Kingdom. It's all a bunch of taking territory, more stupid stuff. But it's Britain, okay? So they're the other group, and then the Soviet Union, which is what they were. Russia today, but the Soviet Union then, those were the big allied forces. And China was helping out. They were on our side as well. And other nations were, but the big three, US, Britain, and the Soviets, were the main, leaders of the allied forces here. And so we're winning, and we do win, and the League of Nations clearly didn't work out. So we replace it with the United Nations, the UN, right? Now, to get it so that the U.S. will actually join, like everybody will be okay with it, and the same goes for, folks in other countries, we come up with the idea of the Security Council, which still exists today. Okay? And so on the Security Council, you have a very important thing, which is the veto. You have veto power, meaning any resolutions, anything that all these different UN countries come together and agree on or vote on or whatever, if you're on that Security Council, you can say no, veto. Right? That's the idea. So you have the power to just sink any resolution or whatever if you're on the Security Council. So of course, because we won the war, right? It's going to be the U.S., Britain, and the Soviets. We get to be on the Security Council, right? And when I say Soviets, so it's 1917 when you have the Bolshevik Revolution. It's actually during World War I when that happens. When we go from, Russia, Tsarist Russia, where it's a monarchy before the revolution, to Lenin and everybody taking over, and it becomes the Soviet Union, right? So that had happened prior to this. Stalin is in power at this time. We're not cool with those commies over there, and Stalin seems like he's a bit unhinged himself, but we're not the mortal enemies that we were in the 70s and 80s. Right before the Soviet Union fell, or the 60s too, or even the 50s, pretty much anything after World War II. Like at this point, they're okay, or they're not what they were at the end of the era of the Soviet Union. Okay, so there's no reason we should have any concern with the three folks on the council. But the Soviet Union, it's like, you know what? No, we don't agree to this at all, right? Because we see you, America and Britain. You guys got something going on. You're all chummy, like you're practically related. You guys are gonna gang up on us, we Russians. We're not gonna do it. So we're not gonna join the UN or the Security Council unless we can bring a friend. We want to bring China, right? And it's kind of like, you got veto power. How can we get? Fine. You know what? Fine. China helped out. Sure. Okay. So then China gets put on the Security Council, but then Britain's like, whoa, 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 whoa. All right. If they get to bring a friend, we want to bring a friend because America, we like you. We don't trust you. And we said, yeah, wise. And so Britain said, no, we're not going to join unless we can bring France. And we're like, France? You kidding? They surrendered. They're all Nazi-ish during the war and all that. We get France? No, come on. I'm like, no, we're not going to do it unless we get France. So France gets put on the Security Council. And so we have these 5 permanent members that seriously are just on there because of this bickering and high school clique kind of stuff going on. But permanently on the Security Council, you've got the U.S., the United Kingdom, Russia, as it is today, France, and China. Okay, so these 5 countries have the ability to veto anything, to shut down the UN, to prevent the UN from actually doing anything. And this is a thing where I always love the conspiracy theories about the United Nations and this like one world order, or kind of thing, where it's like United Nations black helicopters flying around and working behind the scenes. And that's cute because honestly, the UN is worthless. It can't do that kind of stuff. You know why? Because we made sure it couldn't do that stuff, right? And it does. It's not to say the UN doesn't do good work, but the idea of the UN taking over the world, no, because we like built kryptonite into it from the very beginning, right? So it's not the all powerful thing that conspiracy folks sometimes think of. And that's it too. I was given a lecture like this years ago now, and I mentioned black helicopters as I was talking about it. Which, if you don't know what that is, good for you. It's worth a Google. But it's just the idea of like these unmarked, mysterious It's like X-Files kind of stuff out there. But I said that in a class, and at the end of the class, I had a guy who hadn't spoken to me at all throughout the entire semester, and he comes up to me. He's like, "So what exactly were you saying about the black helicopters?" And I got really uncomfortable when he said, and I was, "Oh, I was just kidding. It's make believe. It's not real." And he looked really disappointed. He walked away. So I have to bring that up to let you know, like, there aren't, like, the UN, of all the conspiracy theories to get worked up over and to think about, like, the UN taking over the world, no, that one doesn't make any sense. Like, Jeffrey Epstein being killed in jail, I'll listen to that. There's stuff like that where it makes a little more sense. The UN being this one world order thing doesn't make any sense at all. Okay, just based on how the UN operates. And you can see too, you can click on the link here and see the Security Council. We still have these 5 permanent members, but we also rotate in. I forget how many. It's like 10 more, 15 more. Get these little like 2 or 3 year terms or something like that to sit on the Security Council. Now they don't have veto power, but it's like we allow Ecuador or whatever to come sit at the big kid table. Right? It's like Thanksgiving. You got the grown-up table and you got the kids table. We pull up some countries every now and then from the little kids table to come to the big kids table. They can, listen to the conversation, but of course, give them any power. No, they can't do the actual veto thing. Right? So the UN, it's great. They have done good stuff in terms of humanitarian efforts. It's a great idea to have countries talking together and like working out issues. I'm all for it. The real issue is the Security Council. And this is like I've mentioned the Syrian civil war a little bit. Haven't gone into it in full detail, mainly because we're not in class right now to like watch that little Vox explanation thing and talk about it more. But it's a case of like with all the awful stuff that Bashar al-Assad has done to his people, you question like, why haven't we done anything? Why hasn't the UN gone in and done something? Well, they couldn't, because Russia, an ally with Syria, vetoed any actual action on taking Assad out of power, right? And it's because it's strategic stuff, and it's a long story as to why Russia would actually want to keep such a monster in power. Um, you know, discuss that amongst yourselves as much as you want. But the reason why the UN, and therefore the US and a lot of other places, couldn't just like go in and help out is because Russia has prevented it. They've invoked the veto power. Right? And we can say, oh, boo, Russia. We do it too. Like, it's everybody has done it when it serves their interests if they have the ability to do it. Right? So that's why the UN isn't as great as it could be. Now, as the war is ramping up, before we even get to the post-war, era and putting the UN into place and all that, there's a lot of planning going on behind the scenes. A lot of it is between Winston Churchill, so the Brits, and Franklin Roosevelt, the Americans, like talking together and saying, look, we're going to win this thing. We're going to crush, Hitler and the Japanese, and we're going to be victorious. We need to be ready day one after the war to implement some new systems to ensure that everything's, working smoothly. And it's the United States is making sure that we are part of this global system, right? We're not doing it for the betterment of poor people around the world necessarily. We're doing it to make sure that we're really, taking control of these global markets. And Britain's, part of this too, but we're getting wealthier and we're becoming more and more impressive effectively. We're able to start calling some shots. That's why a lot of this stuff benefits us directly and the Brits kind of secondarily. But there's this conference, the Bretton Woods Conference takes place in New Hampshire before the end of the war. And it was a way to set up, okay, after World War II, global economy. We're going to be connected in a way we've never been connected before. All right, so they came up with some different things. One of the most important ones was this idea of a gold standard for currencies, and it was actually based in U.S. dollars. It was 1 ounce of gold was equivalent to 35 U.S. dollars, and that also meant that for every $35 that the U.S. Treasury had printed, had out there in circulation, there was an ounce of gold that was connected to them, right? So we weren't just printing money just because we could. It was connected to gold, but it was a lot easier, to have paper money or, quarters and nickels than carry around gold dust and, old-timey stuff like that, right? So think like, Fort Knox and like where we have gold secured, that's all connected to our money, okay? And so based on that, if we do that, we can then connect our dollars to other national currencies, to the British pound, right? And then we know, okay, if we're worth $35 for an ounce of gold, the British pound is then going to be worth this much to our $35, and it's just a way to have this exchange rate, which we kind of take for granted today. But it's like if you travel to another country, right, and you bring in $100 and you convert that into so many pesos or whatever euros, whatever currency you're dealing with, you convert that and you get a different amount, but it's equivalent, right? That's the idea. So this is where that really takes off. We didn't have anything like this before World War II, right? And we don't have this anymore. It's worth mentioning. The gold standard is long gone. President Nixon got rid of that. We now have what's just called fiat money, which means, our paper money is not actually connected to anything. It's even more make-believe. And I say even more because people like argue, we got to go back to the gold standard and all that. So like, gold, who decided gold was, the most important mineral out there? Or it's just, it doesn't necessarily even make sense, but we take that to just, like, we go along with that. We'll all collectively believe that gold is this really important thing because it's shiny, and we're cool with that. But to believe that paper is actually worth something, we won't do that. Right? That's silly. It's all silly. It's all, I've said this before, economics. It's all witchcraft and smoke and mirrors and that kind of stuff. But today, we no longer have that ounce of gold directly connected to a certain amount of dollars. It's seen as just, it's just money. It's just numbers on paper. And people will argue to go back to the gold standard. People say it doesn't really matter. It is what it is, right? Just, you can look up more if you're interested in that. But I've never been convinced that going back to a gold standard would necessarily make life better for anybody. So, there you go. Email me if you got if you got a good argument. All right, so we don't have it now, but that was the big thing with the Bretton Woods thing. We also, through this, came up with some new agencies, global organizations that would be out there. And they're global in the sense that they do work around the world, and you can have people from different countries as, contributing to it or sitting on the board or whatever. But they're also heavily American. We put most of the money into this stuff initially. These things, headquartered in the U.S. And this image too. This isn't actually Bretton Woods. This is another secret meeting, like out in the Atlantic. You've got Churchill. You've got FDR. FDR, very cozy with this soldier guy here. You guys know why that is? He had polio and spine issues and was in a wheelchair, but hid that from everybody. to try to, convey this idea of strength. I find that fascinating in light of, like, we know everything about our current politicians today. You could never hide something like being in a wheelchair if you were a president today. I don't know if that's good or bad. That's just another thing to think about right there. But that's what this picture is. But these new organizations, we have three things I'll talk about here that are really relevant to what we're talking about. We have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and then GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. That's later going to really become the WTO, and it's an agreement, that's signed a little bit later. It's not actually set up at Bretton Woods. It's like 47, I think, is when this agreement is signed. The WTO becomes a thing, I think, in the 90s to where it actually is an organization that's dealing with world trade. But all of these here, they're set up to ensure that we have a truly global economic system, that we're not tied down to this country is going to trade with this country and that's it. This colony is going to be, beholden to this country or whatever. It's going to be truly global, with the idea that that's going to help just wealth in general, right? Whether people sincerely believe that or not, I don't know enough about FDR or Churchill to know if they, sincerely believe this would be a good economic thing, or we're just doing it to help out their country and, to hell with everybody else. But this is the new plan, right? Truly global economic system. Now, the IMF, their big role was to oversee these different exchange rates, right? To make sure that we knew exactly how much a dollar was compared to a pound or a ruble or the yen or like whatever other currency was out there. And at the same time, in overseeing exchange rates, this was going to encourage free trade. Okay? And it's the idea, I was talking about free market stuff before. Free trade is the idea of, not having rules in place to limit who's going to import certain goods and export their goods here, and all of that. It's not just an economic system within a country; it's between countries, right? And that concept of free trade is questionable because we'll have stuff like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, but it was an agreement, right? It's not like free in the sense that like do whatever, trade with whomever. So it might not actually mean anything, but it really, free trade simply means trading with other countries, importing and exporting across borders, right? And the idea was, keep in mind, the U.S. is, reeling from the Great Depression still. That was in the, 1929 to 1930 is when that hits. We have that issue. The, World War II, between 39 to 45, we're in what, 42 is when we enter the war. We're still dealing with the Great Depression. We haven't fully come out of it. So that's fresh on our minds. And really, with the Great Depression, it affected countries globally, and it took a while to come out of it, it was seen, because other countries didn't want to trade with the U.S. Banks didn't want to loan out money, across borders and stuff like that, because everybody was worried you want to get your money back. So everybody was holding on to their money, and that kept money from circulating, and therefore it kept people from getting money and spending money, and it kept the economy from growing. So the idea, like they're showing with this chart, this is from the IMF website here, they're just trying to show it took so long. It was a depression and not simply a recession because we didn't have this free trade, because countries weren't helping each other out. So that's the idea here. And I mean, and with this too, I like to bring up this chart. This I pulled out of, a newspaper back in, 2009, 2010, simply because I saw it and went, aha, everybody knows it. This is what kills me. Recessions, they happen like every decade, give or take, right? And you can just look at this stuff. Like, this is trying to show the amount of time it took for recovery and what unemployment rates were and so on. But what they're not really showing you, what nobody talks about, and what I, as a college student and someone who graduated from college and then, went and did all the things he was supposed to, get a job and invest in this and buy a house and that stuff. Nobody told me ever, maybe they were and I just wasn't listening, I don't know, but nobody told me, I'm pretty sure, that we have these recessions like once a decade, right? So, which would have helped a lot of us who had some money back around, 2006, 2005, 2006, as like housing prices are going up and up and up and up, and we have, what we think of as a bubble. Would have been nice if some people said, you know what, hold on to your money for like a year or two because this is going to crash, and then you can buy stuff for real cheap, right? Nobody says that because we forget about this. We have such a short term memory. We don't think about the fact that like if the economy's going well now, just wait, right? Because it ain't gonna stay like this. And we sometimes willfully ignore it because we're like, yeah, but if I get in now, and if I get in just at the top before it crashes, like I could be okay. We sometimes think that, like, I could buy this house now and quickly sell it, and then I can still make a profit, and I'll get out before it's a problem, right? Don't think that way. Just be aware. And we're seeing this too. We're doing quite well for a long, long time since, 2008, 2009. It technically ended in June 2009. So we see here the Great Recession. It didn't officially become a depression because of different data metric stuff. But we're doing well. Economy's grown, but a lot of people were saying, like, this isn't going to last. No. And COVID, we have a pandemic, and yeah, we're right back into a recession. We'll see if it becomes a depression, right? But this is what we do. So this is just my little, bit of advice, little wordly wisdom to students who are going through this stuff who will hopefully graduate, have a decent amount of money, when you get that great job and all that, really launch your career. Just pay attention. Remember that this stuff is all cyclical. Even if we have entities in place that are trying to, prevent this or prevent that, these recessions happen. It's a pretty constant thing that we see occurring, like I said, roughly every decade. All right, pep talk over. Now, the IMF, their whole thing is about all this free trade stuff. I pulled this from their website recently. So they talk about, foster global monetary cooperation, but you see at the end, reduce poverty around the world. So this is something relatively new with the IMF and the World Bank, which I'll talk about next. It's not just about economics and trade and making people money. It's about ensuring that we get rid of poverty, or at the very least, we reduce it. Maybe we can't fully get rid of poverty, but we can at least reduce it. We can help as many people as we possibly can. All right, so just keep that in mind. We'll talk about that when I get into the World Bank and your World Bank report, which I'm going to talk about at the end here. What I want you guys to do for that last report you have for the class. All right, now, with this global economic system that the IMF is overseeing, there's a policy in place, general idea in place about what's the best way to have a global economy, and we have what's called import substitution. This is what's promoted, okay, right after World War II. And it's the idea that all nations around the world, they need to develop their own industries, okay? They still need to be trading, with other countries. It's still going to be a global thing, but you don't want to have to be dependent on another country for whatever commodity, whatever manufactured good, whatever thing it is. You want to, you trade with them, but you also want to have your own, like domestic industry, right? So like the automobile, Americans make cars, and you have some European car companies, and after the war too, we'll start to see, and again, it's this import substitution idea. We'll start to see German and Japanese cars really taking off, kind of encouraged to take off, to bring these countries into that global marketplace to be able to trade, right? And the idea is, in Japan, they should make their own cars, but they should also trade with American companies, right? And to make it a global thing, and that way nobody is totally dependent. Like if we stop producing cars in this country, then Japan's okay because they can make their own cars, right? That's the general idea, right? And so that was everybody was doing that, and disaster, right? At least that's what people have said. It's questionable as to whether it really was a disaster, if this was a bad policy. We can also question whether what we replaced it with was any better. But by the 70s, economists were saying, no, import substitution, it's no good. This picture here of bees on a guy's face. I mean, I just love the picture because it is creepy. But I just put this here to remind me of killer bees, which are the result of import substitution. Killer bees exist because of these policies. That they're a mix between European honeybees and African honeybees, crossbred so that Brazil could have their own honey industry, right? Because they needed their honey. But I didn't want to have to trade with the U.S. or wherever to get it. But sweet little European honeybees weren't, they couldn't survive. They couldn't hang in the Amazon. The jungle was too tough for them. So they crossbred them with these tough African ones. And the idea was you'd get street smart bee, but was still kind of like sweet to you. That was the goal. No, we got killer bees, right? Or what are called Africanized honeybees, which is always charming to think about. That we blame the Africans for the killer bees themselves, even though it was both the European and African bees coming together. And that's not why we got rid of import substitution, but it's just a fun thing to think about. It was really by the 70s we've been doing this for a while, and honestly, what was really obvious is that these smaller countries couldn't compete with the bigger ones, right? The United States have been making cars for decades now, just to keep with the automobile example, but we had developed industries in a lot of things, right? So we already had all this experience. We had factories in place and all these economies of scale ideas where we could keep costs down, so sell things at a low profit margin and be okay. These other smaller countries that just started up with this stuff, they couldn't compete, right? It's a difficult thing to do when something already exists and is this massive thing, right? So a lot of these countries, these developing countries or the global south, were developing these industries with the idea of trying to grow their economy. They just can't cut it because, more people are going to buy stuff like those imported American goods because they're cheaper, better quality, it can be a cultural status symbol and all that stuff too. It just wasn't working out. So we get rid of this in the 70s and transition, going into the 80s with what we call neoliberalism. Okay? And neoliberal, it's a term people love to throw out a lot and say like, you're a neoliberal. And it's kind of the same way, but means the opposite thing. He's like, you're a communist, right? Anybody, on the right who doesn't like somebody on the left, they call them a communist. Anybody on the left who's just called a communist, they say, oh yeah, well, you're a neoliberal. Like it some people actually know what it means, but a lot it's overused quite a bit. But really, neoliberalism is referring to a specific economic policy, and liberal in this sense, it doesn't mean like Democrat as we tend to think about it. It really is talking about freedom in the sense of free trade. Okay? That's what we're getting at with here, and opening up these markets to where it's going to be this new thing, and it's all going to be export-oriented economies in these different countries. And rather than having, these little microcosms everywhere, where instead, look, hey, country X, you're really good at doing this stuff. So you do this stuff. You go for it, and then you trade with other countries to get the other stuff that you're not good at making, right? So if, like, you're in, the tropics and you can grow coffee, we can't do that up here in the U.S., so we're not going to try to have our own coffee bean growing industry, because that doesn't work out. So, you guys near the equator, you all grow the coffee, you'll sell that to us, so we'll import it from you, you get money from us, and therefore you can use that money to, buy our goods, right? And so everybody will do that. And it's the idea, focus on what you're good at. But also, with this comes a whole new way of thinking about what's best for capitalism and global capitalism specifically, One such thing is privatization. Okay? The idea of not having government run industries, but having private companies do stuff, right? So, like, here in this country, we're currently having the debate about public versus private healthcare, whether it's insurance in general or, the doctors in general or whatever. But, like, what's better to get us, healthcare in this country? Is it private companies, running the insurance policies that allow us to go in and use a private hospital? Is it a purely, public system where our taxes all go into one, reservoir of money that we can then, as long as we're an American citizen, we can go into a public hospital and, have free care? Is that kind of thing? Is it a mix, right? Between we have public hospitals, but we also have private insurance and we, blend there. That's what we're getting at, right? So privatization means get rid of as many government run things as possible to replace them with private companies who are doing this stuff, right? And it's the idea behind this is that and we hear this today still, the idea that private companies are just more efficient. You don't have a lot of waste with government. It's always waste and bureaucracy and stuff like that. But a private company, it's smaller, it's more nimble. It can do whatever, and it'll save us money in the long term because we don't have all this waste, right? That's the idea. It's a garbage idea, just so you know. Just, start doing some math, and you can see it doesn't quite add up. Just logically thinking about it for a while, you have to get very magical with some of your numbers to really make that argument that private companies are, streamlined and we're getting the same results, if not better results, with less cost. No, doesn't necessarily work out that way. All right, we can, maybe talk about that later. Deregulation, same kind of idea. Getting rid of government, but in this case, oversight, right? Different laws, different rules in place, especially when it comes to trade, but also locally with, labor laws and stuff like that. Just let people work, right? Just let people do stuff. And it goes back to that whole free market idea of let the markets decide. So that's what we're pushing for with neoliberalism. And then encouraging free trade, encouraging not to have all sorts of rules in place here, but really opening up global marketplaces. And then monetarism is really getting more financial in stuff. Some of the finance stuff that we'll talk about when we get into globalization later on. Okay, so this is now our big push. Starting in the 80s, we still have it going on today. Right? This is the attitude we've had. Or at least it's fuzzier today with Trump. And again, that's another thing I'll talk about when I start talking about globalization. But up until Obama, neoliberalism is what we're doing, from Reagan to Obama. Okay? And so with this, too, because we're so focused on global trade in this way, the IMF, what will become the WTO, and the World Bank are all making sure that we have this truly interconnected global economy. Okay? And the World Bank, its whole concept initially was to rebuild Western Europe. And it was the idea to, Europe is destroyed because it's been, at war with itself and had outsiders coming in for years now. Stuff is blown up, stuff is destroyed, gonna rebuild stuff, right? And so we need a massive bank, right? A world bank, hence the name, to loan money to countries to be able to do work. So it's backed by, the US puts a lot of money in this initially, but it's the idea this isn't like a commercial, Wells Fargo, Bank of America kind of bank. This is some massive government, global organization that if a country needs millions of dollars to borrow to be able to rebuild its roads, to, shore up its fresh, drinking water supply or whatever, it goes to the World Bank so that these commercial banks don't have to assume all the risk and all that. That's the general idea. Now, this happens after World War II while we're doing all this import substitution. By the time we get to this period of neoliberalism, Europe's been rebuilt. Japan's doing okay at this point. It's going to shift to, helping out the developing world, helping out the global south, right? If I'm an impoverished country and I want to fix it, I want to invest in my country. I want to build roads or schools or irrigation canals or whatever it might be. I can't just go to the local bank, or whatever. You go to the World Bank. So they're doing massive, massive lending to other countries. That's what their job is still today. Okay, this is what they do. They loan money to other countries. Okay? Now, they're not a charity. They're a bank trying to make money. They want to get their money back as well as interest, right? So, like with any bank, if they loan money to a country, there are going to be some conditions you got to agree to. And they were called, they don't really call them this anymore, but they're called structural adjustment programs, okay, or SAPs, which just, that's one acronym that it's quite true in what it sounds like and what it is and what it does. But it was the idea that, hey, country, whatever, country X, if you want to borrow money, cool. We got the money. We're happy to loan it to you. But we want you to make some changes. Okay? And what the whole idea with these structural adjustment programs and the World Bank was that they've had specific ideas of what would help make sure that a country could then pay back the money. Right? The reason they're poor in the first place is because they're doing stuff incorrectly anyway. So yeah, we'll let you borrow money, but let's fix your country. Let's do stuff right, so we're not just throwing money away, right? But what the World Bank wanted to see was a very neoliberal, concept here. They wanted to see more privatization, deregulation. They wanted to get government out of everything, right, and allow private companies to come in. Okay, and they preach this idea of austerity, which we still have going on today, where the term itself, in this context, it's referring to, all right, country, you're not doing well. You're, running a deficit, and you can't, you're not going to be able to pay your bills, and people are suffering and all that. What we need to do, we need to cut back on spending, and which sounds reasonable. But quite often, what happens and what the World Bank was doing throughout the 80s and 90s was, cut back on spending, but do it on, the poor folks, right? You're spending too much on welfare, spending too much on government aid, and quite often the idea of even raising taxes never brought up. So leave the wealthy alone because they're job creators. It's that idea. But with the poor folks, they're just taking too much. So, they're dragging you down. So stop helping the poor. And if you do that and you quit controlling this stuff, let private companies bid on, the airlines here or oil and gas extraction or whatever it might be. You do that, we'll gladly loan you the money. Okay? And it was, the idea was that this will make the country itself will be more profitable. It'll just work out, and before you know it, it'll be like, United States 2 is what they'll be like. That was the idea. Even the World Bank, people who have worked with the World Bank have admitted since then, no, it was a scam. It was a way to try to take advantage of poor countries to get access to stuff. Because, like, with this privatization, the idea was, okay, like if we're talking about Bolivia or whatever, get the Bolivian government out of control of industry X, right? And the idea would then be like, so then private Bolivian companies and entrepreneurs can come in and, bid and like take over that industry, and it'll just be run more profitably. More jobs will be created, all that stuff. But it wasn't Bolivian companies that were coming in and taking this stuff over. It was American companies, right? Or European companies, or just companies from countries that were already doing well, already had the resources to come in and buy up the rights to some industry or some resources or whatever. So you have that idea of, actually they're more screwed because profits are now leaving the country and going elsewhere, right? So this isn't like some conspiracy, like, leftist professor thing like, man, it's all a scam, man. No, it was all a scam, man. And it was, people who have participated in it, like, went through a period of writing books to try to make sure they got into heaven or whatever. But it became quite clear that, the World Bank, they were using these saps to sap a country, get it, of its, of its wealth, to help out the already okay countries. The first one to go into place happened in Mexico in the early 80s. And it was a case where the world, loans had been given. So it wasn't a case that World Bank loans and SAPs all came together. The Structural Adjustment Program, that was a product of this neoliberal era, right? So before that, before we actually had these programs in place, money was being loaned out. But you have a place like Mexico, where in the 70s, they're doing okay with their like oil and gas extraction and stuff like that. Now they're making some poor choices when it comes to government spending and all of that, borrowing a lot of money. But what happens is they've got this money that they borrowed, and it was based in U.S. dollars, okay? Because it was from the World Bank and like the IMF was connected to it and all that. But in the U.S. separately, had nothing to do with Mexico specifically. We've got some issues. We're worried about inflation occurring here. We've got, our economies might be headed for some trouble. So we dramatically tweak our interest rates. We shoot our interest rates up in an effort to help our own economy. But see, here's the deal. Mexico had taken out these adjustable rate loans. So not only are they in US dollars, but they're based on the current US interest rate. All right. And so as long as the interest rate was low, everything was fine. Mexico could pay its bills. Suddenly that interest rate, gets jacked up. That means the monthly payment also gets jacked up, the interest that's owed. And so Mexico, having done nothing here, suddenly owes a lot more money back to the World Bank, and there's no way they're going to pay it, right? And I also like to point out too, like with going back to our last great recession, people, blamed the all these irresponsible homeowners that were buying homes they couldn't afford, and they were using these adjustable rate mortgages, and God, shame on these people. It's the stupidest thing in the world. Every country has done this whole adjustable rate loan thing forever. Like anything that we love to blame poor people on and say like, oh, don't you understand finances or whatever, these exact same processes are being done by governments. It's just the governments are bigger and wealthier, and so they're able to, if they make a mistake, they fix it, right? Through more witchcraft and magic and all that, or, whatever, right? So don't let anybody, shame the poor into being the reason why countries have fallen apart or whatever, right? We'll talk more about this stuff with globalization, and we'll connect it to the COVID stuff that's happening now too. But anyway, interest rates go up. Mexico, not looking so good. So the U.S. backs this with the IMF and the World Bank and Mexico. Everybody gets together, says, look, Mexico, shame on you. We can't stay mad at you. We're going to learn from this. Okay, we're going to change the interest rates. We're going to change the amount you owe. You're still going to pay us back, but we'll adjust the interest, and so it'll make it manageable. But we need you to do something for us, right? What's with all this welfare, right? All these poor people just taking from the government, cut them off. That'll make them get jobs. Your economy will get better. Everything will be great. So get rid of that. And by the way, speaking of jobs, what's with all these rules about like how long a person can work and how much they should make, at a bare minimum and all that? Let's get rid of these pesky laws. Let's let people work who want to work, right? I love that right to work concept. Oh, I worked in Arizona, which is a right to work state. When I heard that, I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, everybody's a right to work. But it's the idea. What that really means is it's like, hey, people who are doing manual labor, which technically is what archaeology in Arizona was. It's like glorified, ditch digging. You have a right to work. You have a right to work 12-hour days, with no breaks and all that. That's what that always means. So when you see relaxed labor laws, like let people have the freedom to work, yeah, that's not freedom for the people doing the work. It's more freedom for the people who are paying the people to work to get more out of those people, right? So they did that, and then also opened up, of course, privatization, right? This, and then another one of these things that happened in the 90s, again, because of global economic issues. This is why Mexico is Mexico today, right? And, in the thought that we need to have a wall between the U.S. and the Mexican border, because this country, it's just a mess, and it's full of crime. We got cartels, and we got poor people who are trying to come here and take our jobs. We say that, we don't just do the work and go back a few years and realize, we made it this way to help make our economy go do better, right? And we'll get into maquiladoras and NAFTA and trade and all of that when I get into globalization. It also, we don't question like, the reason why people want to leave Mexico and the rest of Latin America and come up to the U.S. to work, it's not because they want to like steal from us or whatever. It's because we decimated their ability to work or to work for a decent wage and a decent job and all that. So they're coming up here because we're the only place within a reasonable distance to where you can still do that, right? So something to think about. If you're complaining about immigration policies and all that, we need to look back and see the role of the World Bank, what it's done here and in other places. Okay, now the World Bank pretty quickly got a bad reputation. Like from the 80s into the 90s, it became clear that they weren't doing good work, right? Like they were actually being evil, if I may use a bold term here. They were trying to exploit other countries and rack up all this debt and get these countries trapped. Like they'd let countries borrow money, and then the countries, they struggle to pay back that debt, but they need more money, and they'd give. It was like credit card, like predatory lending kind of stuff, but at the global level. So everybody is just sick of the World Bank, even to the point where the World Bank has to go like, yeah, this is not good. We got to change our image, right? Which it's bad when banks are going like, man, we can't even get away with this stuff anymore, right? It's like, what are you going to do? We got all the money. But no, they're going to stop this. It's not about structural adjustment programs. It's about poverty reduction strategies, right? We're going to reduce poverty, and it's about country partnership strategies. All right, that sounds good. All right, it's the idea, like poverty, bad. We want to reduce poverty, therefore we are good. Okay, it's the idea, and it was a way this, and then the country partnership strategy papers that I'll talk about in a second. When I explain your project, you have to do. This is all the idea is it's more country driven. Okay, it's not the bank coming in and outside, the bank itself and like the U.S. and other wealthy countries coming from the outside and saying what to do. We're getting rid of that paternalism. The country is going to have agency. The country is going to have a say in the terms of these loans. With the idea that, how can we be exploiting these people if these people are the ones who are, coming up with the terms, right? That's the idea. And it's questionable as to whether this has in fact worked or not. Is this an actual new program, a new way to deal with stuff? Or is this just structural adjustment programs? We put in a new name, everything's, still corrupt and awful and all that, right? That's the question we have. It sounds nice. Is it nice, right? And so that's what I want you guys to do with your World Bank assignment. Okay, is I want you guys to dig into what the World Bank is doing, and you're going to report back to me. Yeah, is it more of the same stuff? Is it all these structural adjustment programs, or are they actually helping people? Right? Are they? And you'll see on the website now they've got stuff like this page here, understanding poverty, and they've got the dirty children from a lot of issues with that. Again, Poverty Incorporated. They do a good point of at least discussing that idea of images of poor dirty little children, how that's supposed to trigger feelings in wealthy people in other parts of the world. So we'll talk more about that. But is that, are they actually doing something? Are they helping these poor kids or not? You're going to tell me. And in fact, what I want you guys to do, you can read through this stuff. I'm going to actually escape out of here. I've got beautiful the World Bank website pulled up. It's just worldbank.org, and I have it linked in Canvas. If you go in there, you can see the actual assignment and all of that. But I'm going to explain what I'm saying in the assignment. So you go to the World Bank and go into, you can read any of this stuff, but just go into where we work. I'm just going to click on here to go to the main page. And then what I would normally do if I were teaching this in the classroom, I would have you guys sign up for a unique country because you'd be presenting these to me, to the rest of the class. Um, we'd have like a day where everybody's talking about their country, and if you all pick, one country like Guatemala or whatever, it's going to be the worst day ever because I'm going to have to hear 40 discussions of Guatemala over and nothing against the country, but how many times do you want to hear the same thing, right? So I'd make you pick something because we are all COVIDy right now. You don't gotta. You can pick whatever country. I don't really care. But what you want to do as you go through here, and you can do this like regions. You can, if you like really want to do Latin America or the Middle East or whatever, you can go there for ideas. You can also just scroll down here. Now, you're not going to see every single country here that exists because not every country deals with the World Bank, right? Because it's for countries that need the money. Like, we don't need to borrow from the World Bank because, hell, we are the World Bank, right? We're doing okay. So really wealthy countries you're not going to see in here, but these developing countries you will see as we go through. Right? And I'm just going to pick on, let's see, let's just do Ethiopia. That might work, maybe not. So click on here, and it'll tell us all sorts of okay, didn't mean to laugh. I haven't looked at this already. Just this hashtag Africa can. I'm not saying Africa cannot. It's the hashtag. This is already making me think of that whole fight against poverty. Like if I put that hashtag on my post, well then I'm helping. I'm doing my part, right? No. So here it'll give you all sorts of information, projects, this kind of stuff. You can look through, look through a few of these, see if you don't really know what country you want to pick, fine, do whatever. And then let's see, if we click overview, I want you guys to find something specific, okay? And luckily this has it. But as you go through here, the best thing to locate is this country partnership strategy. And then the FY is fiscal year. And in this case, it's 2018 to 2022. And fiscal year is just a way of saying, like when we start measuring economic stuff, we don't necessarily start in January. Okay? It's like the school year isn't the same as the calendar year, right? Because we start school in, August or September or whatever, depending on what college you're dealing with, end in May or June. That's a school year, but it's very different from a calendar year, right? So fiscal year, it's just an economic year, an economic unit of measurement over, time. So it's saying, here's the strategy from 2018 to 2022. I want you to find, for the country you pick, find this country partnership strategy and make sure it's current. Okay? It should be something that is still active. Or at the very least, I'll let you do if it, ends 2020, okay. But ideally it'd be something like this, right? Where it's going to end in 2 years. Let me click on this. And so, and perfect. So it's got the PDF right here. And this one's only 131 pages. Not too long. So you can click on this PDF. And, what else are you doing? You're at home just waiting for school stuff to happen. So reading 130 pages of, development speak should be exciting. And see, look, this first page here, it's got pictures. Look at happy people and clean water and building stuff. Yeah! Fantastic. That's pictures. So you hardly got anything to read, right? Okay, good news. Nobody's actually read this whole document. Like, even the people who wrote it, they've never read it. Nobody reads it. What these should all have, let me scroll down here. So, introduction, we're going to look at that. You'll also find an executive summary in some of these. And an executive summary is a way of saying kind of like introduction. It's doing the same stuff here, but it's a way, it's like, here's all the important stuff. You don't need to read everything. So this introduction was just like, it was like 5 pages or whatever. You can read through this, and look, it's got bold and pictures. My God, this is easy. Go through this. Beautiful. It's 3 pages. You can read through this, and you get a pretty good idea of what's going on. Okay? And what I want you to do is I want you to identify what does the World Bank say is wrong with the country you picked, right? Like economically speaking, or what's hindering development for your country. And this, like, it looks like, they've got two main things here: unsustainable financing model, inadequate feedback mechanisms. Read through there, get a sense of that stuff. So, what does the World Bank say is, a challenge facing your country? And then also, what do you think about that? Do you agree with this? Does it seem like, no, there are other issues at work? I want your own thoughts, your own critique, your own analysis of this stuff as well. So, what does the World Bank say is wrong? What do you think about it? And then I want you to tell me, what does the World Bank say, in this case, Ethiopia needs to do? What are the solutions to these problems? And then you tell me what you think about it. Is that realistic? Yeah, I think actually that seems pretty straightforward. And if Ethiopia does that, sure, they should be fine. Or, no, that doesn't, what? No, that doesn't make sense. So what about this or that or whatever? All right. And I know it might be daunting if you're not a development person to go through here and actually make sense of all this stuff, but do your best. You're humans. You have ideas and thoughts and judgment and all that stuff. Just use your own common sense and think about what it's saying. You don't get an A if you slam the World Bank. You don't get an A if you're like a cheerleader for the World Bank. I want to see your own analysis of what they're saying. So I'm grading you on, can you read through this? Can you tell me the main points? Can you give me the distillation of what the World Bank is saying for the country, right? What are the problems? What are the solutions? But I also want to see that you're thinking about it, that you're actually actively thinking about this stuff and, going from there, right? That's what you're doing with this. I'm also going to say, make sure these papers are in your own writing, your own words, right? Because, like, looking at this, inadequate feedback mechanisms, you'll be tempted to write, another problem are the inadequate feedback mechanisms. Do you know what that is? Do you know what this means at all? I kind of do. I have a sense. I read through to make sure it's exactly what I'm thinking about. But this is development speak. This is how World Bank people and UN people and all these people talk about stuff. It's not how humans talk about it. It's certainly not how a 19 or 20 or 21-year-old college student at AVC talks about this stuff. So take the time to go through and put it in your own words. Because if I just see a bunch of blocks of text, even if you didn't copy and paste, even if you didn't technically plagiarize in the sense that you're just copying stuff down word for word, if you are writing stuff down saying inadequate feedback mechanisms and not showing me what that means, you're going to lose points. All right. And if you have any questions, if you're reading through this, you're like, I don't know what the hell an inadequate feedback mechanism is, send me an email, right? Communicate with me and I'll gladly, help you out with this stuff. Okay. So that's the general idea here. So I'm going to go back, pick a country, any of these countries from the different options that we've got. Okay. Oh, more Africa can. All right, back here. So anyone, again, doesn't matter which one, but they just make sure they have this plan, this country partnership strategy paper, right? And it's actively going. Because some of these, let's just guessing. Let's see what Iran has. Go into overview. Thumbs up. Being so positive. I'm not see. I didn't even read. I don't see a country partnership. Oh, maybe there's here. Yeah. Okay. So the last project closed in 2012, right? So Iran would not work. Okay? That's what you want to look for. Right? You want to make sure if you're not finding it, read through the paragraphs, and there's a good chance World Bank's not doing any work with that country currently. So look for that stuff. Now another thing, I want you to do two additional things here as you're doing this stuff. Well, actually three. Because another thing, you're going to do this, write this report. I'll actually go back. Let me do this. Let me go into Canvas. Load in here. Don't look at my login stuff. Super secret. We'll load in. Go to you guys in cultural geography. Looks like some of you guys are doing your quizzes. excited to grade that. No pictures are showing up because Canvas is struggling. Do I have it linked in here? Oh, it just takes you to the assignments. We'll just go this way. So I'm going to go to your World Bank report. Okay, so this is just explaining. And this is effectively what I said. Now, number 5 here. Oh, actually, let's go to 4. Write a 2-page report of your own. 2 pages. It's nothing. And you don't get clever. Don't go 3 or 4. 2 pages. Just like I said, nobody reads the whole 130-page report on Ethiopia or whatever. They read the intro. Same thing with professors. I mean, let me step back. Bless your little hearts. Whatever you write, I'm going to read because you're all special to me. I just want to read 2 pages. Right? And this should be done. You can adequately do that in 2 full pages. Okay, so keep that in mind. Then also, as you're going through, you do your 2 pages and, spell check, all that stuff. Answering these questions, what just talking about with, 1, 2, and 3 here. Then also just do a Google image search, get a map of your country, attach it to your document. Like, if you're writing it in Word, insert a picture, all right, get a map of Ethiopia or, Guatemala or El Salvador, whatever it is you're doing. Have that in there just to kind of show where it is. If you were presenting it, so number 6, we're not going to do because we're not actually in class and it's silly to make you guys like record yourselves in your closet talking about a country and then submitting it, so don't worry about it. But with this, you don't have to present it, but I would have you guys show on a map where your country is. It's a way to make sure you know where stuff is. We're not going to do that, but at least put a map of some kind that you find online in the report itself. Okay, and that's the normal stuff. I'm going to update this too. I want you to do 2 things. Number 1, after you pick your report, in fact, I'll do this right now. Let's do this. And in fact, I'm going to say this. So I'm doing Ethiopia. Nobody gets to do Ethiopia. All right? Because I'm doing the work for you. And that's going to be boring. If, I have to read the same stuff I've been looking at here. But if I do this, okay, just do Ethiopia, and just do that, and then in Google, and then go to News. Okay, and this is perfect because this actually works with the 2 things I want you to do. So do this news thing, and just look to see if there's any issue at work. Like maybe, like I just see this here, Ethiopia gets a step closer to issuing new telecom licenses. Maybe in the report it's saying, what a problem is with Ethiopia? There aren't any telecom licenses, right? And so if it says that in your paper, this report, then honestly, if it's 2018 to 2022, it means it was written back in, 2016, 2017, at the latest. So that it was a projection, right, into the future. So I want you to look through here and see any news that says, that is relevant. And you might not see anything. That's okay, but I just want you checking. Because you know what I'm going to do when you turn in your paper and I look at it and it looks kind of rosy. If I don't already know what's going on in that country, I'm just going to do this simple 5-second search. And if I see that, oh yeah, like that, Democratic election they needed to have, it devolved into chaos and the military took over or whatever after your report was written, I'm going to take points off of your work, right? So just go through here and see what's going on. And then also, finally, connect it to COVID-19. Connect it to this coronavirus pandemic that everybody has been dealing with, and just give me a general rundown of what's going on in the country, right? Are they doing okay? Is it, having this awful outbreak? Just, it can be a couple of sentences, at the end of the paper, but I want to see it connected to the pandemic itself. All right? Does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. So go through. And I think I put the 15th is when this is due. It's like 2 weeks from when you guys can first see this lecture here. Plenty of time to do this. If you have any issues with the due date, let me know. I'll be flexible, but keep in mind the semester itself ends like May 31st or June 1st or something like that. So we are running out of time to put this stuff off. But let me know if you have any issues. But get working on them. Go through here. I'm going to update a little bit about the coronavirus thing. So I'll have this updated here so it's exactly what I want you guys to do. And I'm the teacher, so I don't have it. But I think when you click on this, it'll have like submit or turn in or something like that. Click on that, upload a Word document or a PDF, and you're fine, right? And that's how you turn it in. All right, does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. All right. And then another thing too, as I was clicking on this stuff, I saw, I'll just mention real quick on the assignments, there is this extra credit thing, this article analysis stuff. I'm not going to talk about it because it's extra credit. If you need to do it, look at it, do it. If you have questions about it, talk to me. Send me an email or whatever. If a bunch of people keep asking me questions, then I'll post something for the whole class. But read through. It should be pretty straightforward. All right? But don't waste your time on that. Right? Focus on the World Bank report. Do that if you're done with everything else. Because to do this 30 points max assignment, which you're not guaranteed to get 30 points. That's if you do everything exactly what I want to have happen in there. You focus on that and you skip this 50-point report, you're actually doing worse than you were in the beginning, right? So just, think about that. Hold that off until the very end. I'll accept this article analysis thing until the end of the semester. So focus on that World Bank report. Get going on it. Find your country. Think about development. Watch Poverty Incorporated. Learn about how much the world sucks. And I'll do a debriefing on Poverty Incorporated, in a bit, whenever I get around to it. All right? Does that make sense? All right, geographers. Best of luck to you. Stay safe and all that, and I'll talk to you later.